Springheeled Jack, a mysterious humanoid figure that haunted the streets of London for over 100 years, was thought to be many things. A ghost, a demon, an alien, a supposed urban legend. But in my opinion, he kinda seems like one of the world's first supervillains. Possessing inhuman strength, allowing him to jump the height of buildings, glowing red eyes, a tight-fitting white bodysuit-like garment, a helmet, clawed hands, and the ability to breathe fire. Springheeled Jack would terrorize citizens of the United Kingdom for over 100 years. He had a reputation like that of the boogeyman, and children would be warned that if they didn't behave, Springheeled Jack would leap up to their bedrooms and stare at them throughout the night. But staring wasn't all Springheeled Jack would do. He had a penchant for sexual assaults and physical attacks as well. On Cryptid Caravan, we explore the myths that have been proven true, the reality behind the legends, and the creatures on this earth just waiting to be discovered. If you're curious about the monsters and mysteries that this world still holds, then like the video and subscribe, so you aren't caught unprepared if you're ever wandering the streets of London at night and you see a threatening-looking man jump over a house in your direction. In the early 1800s, many reports would surface of ghosts stalking the streets of London, the most famous up to that point being the Hammersmith ghost, who my last video was on. Check it out. But the Hammersmith ghost wasn't the only spirit terrorizing locals. Another apparition, the Southampton ghost, was also reported assaulting individuals in the night, and this particular spirit shared many characteristics with the figure who would come to be known as Springheeled Jack, reportedly possessing the ability to jump over entire houses, and some even described the spirit as being over 3 meters tall. But the story that would spawn the name Springheeled Jack comes from a woman by the name of Mary Stevens. Mary, in 1837, was walking to Lavender Hill, where she worked as a servant. On her way through Clapham Common, suddenly a mysterious figure leapt at her from a dark alleyway. He grabbed her immediately, squeezing her tightly in his arms, immobilizing her. He started kissing her all over her face, ripping off her clothes, and scraping her flesh with his claws in the process. His hands were, quote, cold and clammy, as those of a corpse. Mary screamed, causing her attacker to flee. Several citizens heard her and rushed over, offering to search for the mysterious, aggressive man, but were unable to find him. The very next day, near Mary's home, a figure with a very similar description to that of Mary's attacker jumped in the way of a passing carriage, jumping again immediately over a 9-foot wall, while cackling in a high-pitched, ringing laughter. The coachman driving the carriage panicked, not wanting to hit the man that had appeared in his path. He swerved and lost control of the carriage, causing a crash resulting in severe injury to himself. These two events were the first attributed to this specific spirit, and as news spread, the press and public dubbed the mysterious man Springheeled Jack. A few months after these sightings, on January 9th, 1838, the Lord Mayor of London, Sir John Cowan, revealed to the public an anonymous complaint he had received several days earlier, which he had withheld in the hope of obtaining further information. The person who wrote the letter signed it, a resident of Peckham, and it read,
"It appears that some individuals have laid a wager with a mischievous and foolhardy companion that he durst not take upon himself the task of visiting many of the villages near London in 3 different disguises: a ghost, a bear, and a devil. And moreover, that he will not enter a gentleman's gardens for the purpose of alarming the inmates of the house. The wager has, however, been accepted, and the unmanly villain has succeeded in depriving 7 ladies of their senses. two of whom are not likely to recover, but to become burdens to their families. At one house, the man rang the bell, and on the servant coming to open the door, this worse-than brute stood in no less dreadful figure than a spectre clad most perfectly. The consequence was that the poor girl immediately swooned, and has never from that moment been in her senses. The affair has now been going on for some time, and strange to say, the papers are still silent on the subject. The writer has reason to believe that they have the whole history at their finger ends, but, through interested motives, are induced to remain silent.
The Lord Mayor seemed fairly skeptical, but a member of the audience that he read the letter to confirmed that servant girls about Kensington, Hammersmith, and Ealing tell dreadful stories of this ghost or devil. The story was reported in the Times on the 9th of January, and on the 11th, the Lord Mayor had another gathering, showing letters he had been sent in the past couple days from various places in and around London, complaining of these wicked pranks. One letter claimed several young women in Hammersmith had been frightened into dangerous fits, some having been severely wounded by a sort of claws the miscreant wore on his hands. While another claimed that in Stockwell, Brixton, Camberwell, and Vauxhall, several people had even died of fright. Even more reports described attacks that had taken place in Lewisham and Blackheath too. So the problem was widespread, and the attacks seemed to be happening at an increasing rate. The mayor wasn't entirely convinced though, thinking, quote, the greatest exaggerations had been made, and that it was impossible for the ghosts to perform feats of the devil upon earth. But someone the mayor trusted told him of a servant girl who had been scared into fits by a figure in a bear skin. The mayor stated that the person or persons involved in this pantomime display would be caught and punished, instructing the police to search for the reported prankster, even offering rewards to the public for any information that would lead to the capture of this mysterious individual. In April of that year, another report came in, how a gardener in Rosehill, Sussex had been terrified similarly by a person wearing a bear skin. The creature let out a low growl, attracting the gardener's attention, then scaled the garden wall and ran along it on all fours, before jumping down and chasing the gardener. Eventually, it climbed back up the wall and made its escape. One of the most well-known accounts of Springheeled Jack comes from the story of a woman named Jane Alsop, reporting that on the night of February 19th, 1838, she answered the door of her father's house to a man who claimed he was a police officer. He told her that they had caught Springheeled Jack in the lane, and asked her to bring a light source. She brought the man a candle, and he immediately threw off his cloak, presenting a, quote, hideous and frightful appearance. He spat blue and white flames from his mouth, and his eyes glowed red. Without saying another word, he grabbed her, and began tearing her nightgown with his claws, which she was certain were made out of some sort of metal. She screamed for help, and managed to get away from him, running back to the house, but he would catch her, tearing up her neck and arms with his claws. Her sister would come out and interrupt the attack, causing the assailant to flee. Jane reported he wore a large helmet and a very tight-fitting white bodysuit, resembling an oilskin, a waterproof covering sailors wear. Another well-known case comes 9 days after the attack on Jane Alsop. An 18-year-old Lucy Scales and her sister were returning home after visiting their brother, a butcher who lived in Limehouse, a district of London. As they passed Green Dragon Alley, they noticed a man standing in the passage, and as they came up to him, he spouted a quantity of blue flames in her face, momentarily blinding her, and causing her such distress she dropped to the ground and was seized with violent fits continuing for several hours. The brother heard his sister screaming and ran up Green Dragon Alley to find Lucy laying on the ground, his other sister holding her. He took her back to his house and learned from his sister what had happened. She described Lucy's attacker as being tall, thin, and gentlemanly, wearing a large cloak, and carrying a small lantern similar to the kind used by the police. He did not speak, or even try to grab Lucy after breathing fire at her. He just quickly walked away. The police were able to speak to several suspects, but all were set free. Immediately after the attack, however, a man came forward by the name of Thomas Milbank. He boasted that he was Springheeled Jack, and was immediately arrested and tried at Lambeth Street Court. Thomas had been wearing white overalls and a greatcoat, which he dropped outside the house, and they also found a candle he had dropped as well. However, he was never convicted, because Jane Alsop insisted that her attacker had breathed fire. Thomas admitted he could do no such thing. After these specific attacks, Springheeled Jack became a very popular character. Attacks would continue to be reported to newspapers, and he became the subject of several plays performed in theaters at the time. Descriptions of Springheeled Jack and his tendency to wear a bear skin even led to the devil being renamed Springheeled Jack in some instances, including Punch and Judy puppet shows, as recounted by Henry Mayhew in his London Labour and the London Poor, a journalistic article written about the working people of London.
This here is called Satan. We might say the devil, but that ain't right. And gentlefolks don't like such words. He is now commonly called Springheeled Jack, or the Russian Bear. That's since the war.
As his fame grew, his attacks became less frequent, however, started occurring further away from London. But in 1843, he became fairly active again. Attacks on mail coaches were becoming more and more common, and a report from Northamptonshire described him as being the very image of the devil himself, with horns and eyes of flame. A few years later, in July 1847, a Springheeled Jack investigation was held in Teignmouth, Devon, leading to a Captain Finch being convicted of 2 charges of assault against women, during which he was disguised in a skin coat, which had the appearance of a bull's hide, a skull cap, horns, and a mask. But he, of course, couldn't be tied to any of the other attacks. Meanwhile, in Devon, a phenomenon known as the Devil's Footprints would occur, in which after heavy snowfall, trails of hoof-like marks appeared overnight in the snow, covering a total distance of 40 to 100 miles. It was suggested by religious leaders that Satan had visited the town, since the tracks were made of a cloven hoof, and appeared to originate from a bipedal creature. Others believed it was the tracks of Springheeled Jack. Sightings, however, would die down yet again, until the beginning of the 1870s, when Springheeled Jack would be reported again in several places far away from each other. In November 1872, the News of the World reported that Peckham was in a state of commotion owing to what is known as the Peckham Ghost, which later in the article they would identify as Springheeled Jack himself. Then in April 1873, it was reported that there were numerous sightings in Sheffield of the Park Ghost, which locals also later began to identify as Springheeled Jack. In August 1877, a group of soldiers reported encountering Springheeled Jack at Aldershot Garrison. A sentry on duty at the North Camp gazed into the darkness of the night, when he would notice a strange figure advancing towards him. The soldier shouted at the figure, but didn't receive an answer. Then, the figure appeared beside him and slapped him several times in the face. In some recountings, a guard apparently shot at him, but the figure wasn't affected. while in other stories it says the soldier may have fired blanks at him, or fired warning shots. But in both, the figure leapt away with astonishing bounds and disappeared into the darkness unaffected. A Lord Ernest Hamilton also reported more sightings at Aldershot. In 1878, when his regiment had moved there, similar occurrences started happening. The panic became so overwhelming to the soldiers they would be issued ammunition in order to, quote, shoot the night terror on sight. After which the appearances immediately stopped. Lord Hamilton believed that these appearances, however, may have just been pranks, carried out by one of his fellow officers. However, there is no record of anyone ever being disciplined for the pranks. In 1877, Springheeled Jack was reportedly seen at Newport Arch in Lincoln, Lincolnshire. He was said to be wearing a sheepskin, and an angry mob was said to have chased the man, cornering him and shooting at him, but their bullets had no effect. He would leap over the building he was cornered against and escape. He would be seen a couple more times in the following years, such as on a church rooftop in 1888, but by 1905, reports of Springheeled Jack would die out, leaving a lasting mark on the world of pop culture. He would live on in literature, warnings made to misbehaving children, and supposed non-fiction writings of his effect on the United Kingdom. Eventually, in stories, he became a more altruistic figure, an avenger of wrongs, and is thought to be a precursor to modern superheroes. But like I said at the beginning, he seemed more like a real-life supervillain. No one was ever caught and identified as Springheeled Jack, due to his seemingly supernatural powers, and the wide range of locations he appeared in, sometimes almost simultaneously. Some researchers believe he was simply mass hysteria, perhaps stemming from a single attack or series of attacks, while other skeptics believe that one individual may be behind its origins. That individual would inspire several copycats throughout the years, which the arrest of Captain Finch does lend some credibility to. There are reasons to believe this idea, such as a letter written to the mayor accusing a group of young aristocrats as the perpetrators of these indecent acts, or an Irish nobleman with a history of bad experiences with women and police officers. The nobleman, the Marquess of Waterford, was often in the news for drunken brawling, brutal jokes, and vandalism. It was said he would do anything for the sake of a bet. He was also reportedly living in the London area during the time the first attacks were taking place. He was accused in 1880 by a man named E. Cobham Brewer, who said the Marquess would amuse himself by springing on travelers unaware, to frighten them, saying that others have followed his silly example. However, the Marquess married and settled in County Waterford, reportedly leading an exemplary life until he died in 1859, which doesn't really explain the attacks and sightings that occurred after that date for the next nearly half a century. Some believe Springheeled Jack was actually an extraterrestrial entity, with his reflective red eyes, alleged phosphorus breath, and inhuman jumping ability originating from a life on a higher gravity planet, while some believed he was a demon, summoned into this world by practitioners of the occult. A similar being, known as Perak the Springman of Prague, was reported to have been seen in Czechoslovakia between 1939 and 45. He too had a similar origin, though he was never reported to have directly attacked people. He did jump out of nowhere, startling passerbys. Much like Springheeled Jack, Perak also went on to be featured in cartoons and comics as more of a heroic figure than villainous. In fact, another very similar creature has been reported, all the way across the pond in the United States, but going by a different name. The Vampire of Mineral Point. Reported sightings of the creature span back to 1981, almost a century after the last Springheeled Jack attacks were said to have taken place. In Mineral Point, Wisconsin, a minimum of 3 real vampire sightings were said to have taken place between 1981 and 2008. In each situation, police were called and responded to resident complaints, uncovering evidence that points to the existence of the vampire. Because there was a 23-year gap between the first 2 reported sightings, it's unlikely that the first story influenced the others. And in all of the sightings, the description of the figure remained the same: a tall, thin, pale, caped figure. Officer John Pepper had received multiple reports that someone who looked suspiciously like a vampire was haunting Graceland Cemetery. The visit was initially intended to placate anxious citizens and put rumors of a vampire to rest. But when Officer Pepper spotted the vampire, it became much more serious. Officer Pepper chased the vampire, but its otherworldly leaps allowed it to escape. The officer would make a report about it, that it had escaped when it reached the 6-foot-tall fence surrounding the cemetery and leapt over it. The next morning, Pepper and other officers returned to the cemetery, finding footprints in the snow leading up to the fence, but they completely disappeared on the other side, leaving no trace. This led the other officers to believe it was all a ruse, and they dropped the case. No sightings would occur for another 23 years, but in 2004, the vampire resumed its stalking of local residents. Witnesses would claim that a creepy-looking man had attacked people residing in a nearby apartment building by jumping at them from the branches of a tall tree. Police were called, and they spotted a man who not only fit the description of the vampire, but seemed eerily familiar to them. He was again able to flee, leaping over a 10-foot wall. Once again, he left behind footprints, but once again, they had also disappeared after the wall he had been seen jumping over. It is thought he potentially transformed into a bat, allowing him to fly away from the officers. Although not as active as Springheeled Jack, the vampire of Mineral Point would make one more notable return. A Mineral Point couple was fishing when they heard strange noises. Looking in the direction the noises were originating from, they witnessed as the so-called vampire climbed up from under the jetty. Brandon Hines, the man fishing, threw his flashlight at the creature. Then the couple fled to his car. They would report their sighting to the police, and the officers would once again go to investigate. All of the couple's fishing gear remained exactly where they had left it, but the flashlight Brandon had thrown at the creature was missing. While it isn't confirmed that the Mineral Point vampire and Springheeled Jack are one and the same, there are similarities in the stories. Enough to make one wonder if Springheeled Jack relocated to North America after becoming too well known in the United Kingdom. To this day, Springheeled Jack appears in TV shows, audio dramas, songs, and my favorite appearance, his enchanted boots are in a quest in the Elder Scrolls Oblivion. But reports of the mysterious figure have all but died out in his apparent homeland. Mysterious creatures nowadays seem harder to come across. Whether this is due to humanity's more scientific approach to life as a whole, or whether the creatures have been made aware of our ability to capture encounters on camera, it seems that in the modern age, these unidentified cryptids, monsters, and mysterious humanoids are becoming less and less widespread. But I hope they will live on in folklore and the curious minds of crazy people like myself forever. Thank you for watching this episode. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, and/or share the video. It helps getting more people to see it, and helps keep me motivated to bring you guys more creepy stories. I don't necessarily believe Springheeled Jack ever truly existed in his enhanced supervillain form, but I do believe someone out there was the cause of the legend. leading to more copycats and similar crimes taking place. But, as always, that doesn't mean my opinions are fact. Keep on creepin', and I'll see you next time.